Okay, well, welcome everybody to this event. I will say that the panel discussed ahead of time and decided that we were okay being unmasked, but we do want to encourage the audience to still remain masked. So just based on the policy of the Observatory thus far. So anyway, good evening and welcome to Making Michigan, which is the Bentley's series on the history of the University of Michigan. I'm Gary Krenz. This is our first hybrid version of Making Michigan. If you're familiar with the series, you know that the past 2 years, for obvious reasons, we have been online only. And I'm really happy to welcome both our online audience, which is joining us on YouTube, and the audience here at the historic Judy and Stanley Frankel Detroit Observatory. And because this is a bit of an experiment, we really welcome any feedback that you have, you folks online and you folks right here in the room, so thank you. I also want to welcome our panel members, who I'll introduce in just a moment. But before that, I want to say that as the archives of the University of Michigan, the Bentley Historical Library acknowledges that the historical origins and present locations of the University of Michigan were made possible by cession of lands by Anishinaabe and Wyandot people under coercive treaties common in the colonization and expansion of the United States. We note in particular the grant of land made by the Anishinaabe under the Treaty of the Foot of the Rapids for the, quote, college at Detroit, so that their children could be educated. These lands continue to be the homeland of indigenous people, and we seek to reaffirm and respect their contemporary and ancestral ties to the land and to recognize their contributions to the university. Now, part of the mission of the Detroit Observatory, like our parent institution, the Bentley Library, is to promote appreciation and understanding of university history. But we are, of course, not alone in that. And I'm thrilled to be joined tonight by 4 individuals who, as editors and writers, are also contributing to this understanding through the stories that they write and publish in publications across the campus. Tonight, each of them will share a bit about a story or stories they have published over the past year. We'll follow that with some discussion of the panel about the writing of U of M history, the publishing of U of M history, and a few other topics. And then we'll open it up to Q&A from the audience and both here and online. So now our panel. Our first speaker will be Sharon Morioka. Sharon has been, since May, a writer on the law school's communications team, where she crafts stories to position the school as a preeminent center of research, teaching, and engagement. She joined the team in May following 15 years as editor of Michigan Alum Magazine and newsletters at the U of M Alumni Association. There, she oversaw all aspects of the publications, including content development, working with writers to connect U of M alumni to the university and fellow alumni. Among some of the most engaging stories are those that focused on the history of the university and its students, faculty, staff, and alumni, and it is that perspective that she brings to tonight's panel. Sharon enjoys all aspects of telling U of M stories, from brainstorming ideas to polishing the final piece. She is also a grammar nerd who enjoys wrestling with questions of periods, commas, and semicolons. I don't want to take us too far afield in the discussion, but I would love to talk about semicolons. So following Sharon, we will hear from Kim Clarke. Kim manages the U of M Heritage Project, a narrative website that explores the people and episodes of Michigan's past. The Heritage Project has been recognized with a State History Award from the Historical Society of Michigan and the Circle of Excellence Gold Award for Writing from the Council for Advancement and Support of Education. Kim is an award-winning writer herself with long experience in newspapers and higher education communications. She is editor of Always Leading, Forever Valiant, Stories of the University of Michigan, 1817 to 2017, a copy of which is out in the lobby if you want to take a look. She holds a bachelor's degree in journalism from Central Michigan University and a master's in American culture from Eastern Michigan. And I have to add, I had the tremendous pleasure of working with Kim when she was director of communications for the U of M Bicentennial. Lara Zielin, our next speaker, is editorial director of the Bentley Historical Library, where she oversees communications, including the Bentley's award-winning twice-yearly publication collections, also available in the lobby. I should have told you guys to bring your publication. Prior to joining the Bentley, Lara was the communications director in the College of LSA's advancement office. For more than a decade, she edited LSA magazine, reaching more than 150,000 alumni each issue and serving as a major fundraising vehicle for the college. This year, Lara will celebrate 20 years of working at U of M and writing about all things maize and blue. Congratulations. That's great. And she has, in fact, been instrumental in developing the Making Michigan series, and I've really enjoyed working with her on that. Finally, Deborah Holdship is the editor of Michigan Today, the monthly editorial email distributed to some 400,000 U of M alumni, faculty, and staff worldwide. And I should say that Michigan Today's ongoing heritage and tradition feature is a regular source of great writing on U of M history. Deborah joined the university in 2007 as editorial manager in the marketing communications department at the Michigan Ross School of Business, where she was editor of the school's Dividend magazine. Prior to working at Michigan, Deborah was Associate Director of Publications at the UCLA Anderson School of Management. And from 1988 to 2001, she worked in the entertainment industry in Los Angeles as a reporter and editor at Billboard magazine and as an associate editor and video producer at 2 multimedia entertainment companies. So welcome, thank you all for coming, and without further ado, Sharon, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you, Gary. That was very nice. So today I'm going to talk about a story that we published, the Michigan Alum magazine published last winter. It was called Life Under Curfew. It was by Jennifer Davis. Before I talk to you too much about the story, the actual article, I kind of wanted to give you a bit of background about it, how it came to being, why we developed it. So that takes us back to 1960 when, as you know, JFK spoke at the Michigan Union, giving his idea of the Peace Corps, his concept of the Peace Corps. On the 50th anniversary of that speech at the university, the Alumni Association published an article about the speech and how it sort of motivated students to take action. So that was, a very well-received article, and so, it sort of had its place for about 10 years. Then on the 60th anniversary of the actual Peace Corps, the founding of the Peace Corps, we put a link in our Facebook page about the story. We didn't modify it at all. It was just a link to the story, but it got a lot of engagement in our social channels. So one of the comments that sort of stood out to me was from alumni who were posting about the curfew that they had to go to that night, recalling that because JFK, as we all know, was very late that night, they kept having to extend the curfew for the women. So one of the things that kind of struck me as, a two-time alumna from the university, someone whose daughter attends the university and someone who has worked here for several years, was I'd never heard of the curfew. This was complete news to me. I'm sure, people, maybe historians knew about it, but it was just completely new to me. So it kind of lit a match in my head. It's like, the light bulb went on over my head. I thought, well, maybe there's a story here. There were these 2 comments. So I talked to one of our freelance writers about it. Her name is Jennifer Davis, and I put tenacious in there because she really had to do a lot of digging about this article. We had just these 2 women who had put something in the Facebook page. I also told her to go to the Bentley. Obviously, the Bentley is a great source of information. Talk to an archivist there. I also suggested she talk to the U of M Alumni Council, which has been around for a long, long time and is very supportive of, obviously, women women alumni. So I gave her the little bit of information I have, and she just was very excited, and she just decided to run with it. Unfortunately, she kept running into some brick walls. The Bentley has just great information about women at the history of women at the university, but not so much about the curfew, at least not enough for us to write the story we wanted to write. I think the best source of information we had was from the Heritage site. There was an article a couple years ago about the in loco parentis rules for men and women, decades ago. But so there was some information there about the curfew, but we really wanted her to flesh it out more, and she just, she couldn't find much online besides that article. The archivist was also having trouble finding, what we were looking for. So what she did was she just started talking to some of the women who were around. These are women who were co-eds back in 1960, but now they're like grandmothers whose granddaughters are going to college. So it was really kind of interesting. But once she started talking to these women, they started saying, well, you really should talk to so-and-so, and you should talk to so-and-so. So it really became more of an oral history, which was great because we wanted to hear in their own words what these women's experiences were, good and bad. And most of it they weren't really thrilled with, as you can imagine. So Jennifer she persisted, and the article finally appeared in the winter issue of the magazine, and we were very happy with it. We got a lot more out of it than we thought we would when she began working on it. So the article itself, just to tell you a little bit about it, is about the curfew that was implemented in the very early 1900s. According to the Bentley, it's likely that U of M's formal policy was implemented when Myra Jordan became the Dean of Women. That's something else we learned. There was something called a Dean of Women at the university. And she began this league house system, which is sort of a coordinated system of boarding houses, which the policy for in loco parentis rules, as I said, guided some of the rules for women. And let me see. And I'm sorry, I'm trying to track my notes here. So one thing that we did find was that a lot of the women said, they just found these rules very irritating. Who wants to have to be told when to come home, especially from today's perspective. But they also said that it was interesting to us that they said they just took it for granted. It's just like, well, why wouldn't we have had rules that the men didn't have to abide by? So, it wasn't quite the age of rebellion. Most of these women were there that we talked to were there in the late 50s, early 60s. So it wasn't really before the sexual revolution. So they weren't used to thinking, well, maybe there's something wrong with this. But after a while, I'm sorry. So let me just backtrack a little bit. The rules that went along with the curfew, some of them included house mothers were the people who had to implement the rules. Every dorm, every sorority house had a house mother, so they were the ones who really had to enforce these rules. And just quoting from the article, it said that they sort of stood guard at the front doors each night to make sure that the women did come in when they had to. And there were also penalties for the women if they were late too many times. They had to sign in and out. And the penalty could be as bad as having to appear before the Women's Judiciary Council. So there were rules. It wasn't just like in name only. So in addition to the house mothers and these rules, campus police saw women out at night. They wouldn't arrest them, but they would definitely make sure the women got escorted back to the house and make sure that the house mothers knew about this. So that resulted in a few things, one of which isn't surprising, women bending the rules. Some would just refuse to sign in and out. Some, I think there was an instance where someone at the Henderson House told us the Henderson House had a ping pong table in the basement, so girls would go down there to type their papers. So if someone came knocking on the window at night, they would open the window so the house mother wouldn't know that they had missed their curfew. So, it was very restrictive, and as you can imagine, throughout the 60s, as civil rights became an issue and as women's rights became an issue, the rules started to ease a little bit. So, I think that started in 1962. The rules were abolished for senior women, and then by 1970, they were officially abolished for everyone. Let me see. Oh yeah, the impact on women. One thing Jennifer was sure to mention was it wasn't just socially. It wasn't just women who wanted to stay out, at dinner or at a movie with their boyfriends. What they also wanted to do sometimes was stay late at the lab, stay late at the library, stay late to see JFK. So it really affected their whole education. It wasn't just a social thing. And then in the course of Jennifer's work, she also stumbled upon just a couple of other anecdotes. We didn't really know what to do with these because they didn't fit into the theme of the curfew. But we had this sidebar, which you can see, I don't know, right there, about other things that women had to face. Like, I'm sure many of you know, the Michigan League was only open to men, and women couldn't walk through the front door of the Michigan Union until 1956. The marching band until Title IX was passed 50 years ago this year, women weren't allowed in the marching band. So things like that, just, you think this was, 2 generations ago, 3 generations ago, and these were actually rules that women had to live by. So it was quite eye-opening. So we posted the story, the curfew story, in our Facebook page again, and we got a lot of comments, a lot of engagement, 116 comments during the month of March, this past March. The story was the second most clicked story online for the Alumni Association. And of course, among many of those comments were stories from women who told their own curfew stories, their own stories about, limitations they had as students here. And, okay, I think my last slide isn't there. But anyway, it was just very interesting to hear these stories from women. And some of the women said, there isn't a lot of information out there. For example, they didn't know, they couldn't remember, at least we got differing opinions on when the actual curfews were, like what time. Some women said midnight on the weekdays, some women said 10 o'clock on the weekdays. So Jennifer really said, it's important to get these stories now. I don't want to be morbid, but, in a few years, a few decades, some of these women might not still be with us. So it's really important to get these oral histories now to learn, and I think it just shows, the importance of University of Michigan stories is not just, things you might find in documentation at the Bentley, but actual stories that people can tell of their experiences, I think are just really important. And I think we're going to talk a little bit later about what makes history at the university, make a historical story. I think these types of personal stories are just really interesting, and it can be anything, but we'll talk more about that later, and I don't want to take too much time. So.
Hello. So, the University of Michigan Heritage Project is a website of long-form narrative stories. We started this back in about 2013 as to sort of prime the pump for the bicentennial. We wanted to begin to whet people's appetite and engage them with some storytelling. So I want to talk tonight about a story I did earlier this year called The Dignity of Man. This is a gentleman named Paul Cornelli. He was the first African American in the country to earn a doctorate in public health, and he did so from here. Over the course of his very long career, he really helped to transform healthcare in the country by ending separate but equal treatment and integrating medical and clinical care for African Americans. He said at one point that segregation and discrimination are just as damaging to health as water pollution, unpasteurized milk, and smog. And this is what drove him his entire career. He came to U of M in 1926. In the larger photo here, the Negro Caucasian Club, he is right smack dab in the center. He's in the middle row, in the middle. He came from Detroit. He went to high school in Detroit. He spent his first year of college at what we call today Wayne State University. He transferred here and he wanted to be a doctor, so he took an LSA pre-med course. And he joined the Negro Caucasian Club, which was a very new club, student organization, black and white students who were committed to improving racial ties. And so they would bring well-known black speakers to campus, largely because the university wasn't going to be inviting them, so they took it upon themselves to invite these speakers. And the students themselves conducted sit-ins, and Paul Cornelli was one of them. This is where they would go to restaurants in Ann Arbor that would not serve black people, because the owners claimed, if black people eat in my restaurant, paying white customers will leave. And so Paul and some of his classmates would go in and they would sit down and absolutely nothing happened. The white customers did not leave. And they just sort of blew out of the water this argument of the restaurant owners. But he said many years later that racism was rampant, both on campus and in Ann Arbor. He graduated in 1928, and he immediately enrolled in medical school here at Michigan. He was one of 4 black men in a class of about 160 medical students, and he decided he wanted to become a thoracic surgeon. He was a very good student. In fact, he was the first black student at Michigan to be inducted into Alpha Omega Alpha, which is the Medical Honorary Society. He graduated from medical school in 1931, and he wanted to do his internship, or what we today call a residency, at University Hospital. University Hospital did not employ black doctors. They wouldn't take black residents. So the irony that we would educate black people to be physicians but not hire them was pretty striking when I was researching this story. So he went off to Durham, North Carolina to work at Lincoln Hospital, which is a segregated hospital, which was how healthcare was in the South at that time. And this is where he began to really see firsthand the damage of segregation on the health of African Americans. So this is Lincoln Hospital. He wasn't there very long when he faced a big career decision that he certainly had not been expecting. A gentleman by the name of Numa Adams, Dr. Numa Adams, who's up here on the right, he was the dean of the College of Medicine at Howard University. Howard University, as you probably know, is a historically black university in Washington, D.C. And Dr. Adams was going around the country approaching talented black physicians and trying to recruit them to come to Howard. So he said to Paul Cornelli, I will pay for you to go back to school if you will get your doctorate in public health. You do that, and then I'll take care of your debt, and I will employ you at Howard. I'll put you on the faculty at Howard. So Paul Cornelli was like, I don't know what to do. I've spent a lot of time and money working to become a physician. And he also remembered from his days as a medical student that doctors just kind of looked down on the field of public health. It was a tier lower than being a physician. And did he want to sort of take a step back in his career like that? But then he remembered 2 faculty members that he had here at Michigan when he was doing his pre-med studies. And they were Nathan Sinai and John Sondwall. They were both public health professors. We didn't have a school of public health yet. We had studies in public health, but the school itself wasn't created until 1941. But Cornelli remembered these 2 men because he found them so engaging as professors. He said that John Sondwall had a missionary zeal for spreading public health to every crook and corner of the United States. And he felt the same way about Sinai, who was a very different person in terms of personality, but he was so struck by them and so impressed by them that he thought, well, these guys are so committed to public health, maybe I will try it. And so for the 3rd time in his life, he enrolled at U of M and began his doctoral studies. He received his doctorate in 1934. As I said earlier, it made him the first black man in the country to have a doctorate in public health. And then he went back to Howard, not back to Howard, he went to Howard, where Dr. Adams had promised him a position. He ended up spending almost 40 years there. He was a professor, he became a department chair, he directed the campus student health service, and he became the medical director of Freedman's Hospital, which was Howard's teaching hospital, and it served the African American community of Washington, D.C. And all the time that he's on the faculty, and this photo is him teaching a class at Howard, all the time he's on the faculty, he's doing research. And his research is showing over and over again that the separate but equal healthcare approach in this country is failing black Americans. That the mortality rates for African Americans are much higher for white people, particularly in the rural South, which is where most black people lived prior to World War II. They were dying of heart disease, tuberculosis, pneumonia, venereal disease, complications from childbirth, all diseases and medical issues that were preventable and were not killing white people at the same rate. And so he would constantly publish papers showing this. And he was making the argument that this was because of racism. And there were many factors behind that. There was a shortage of black physicians around the country because white medical schools were not enrolling them. Segregated hospitals, like the one where he worked in North Carolina, were grossly underfunded. They were using outdated equipment. They didn't have enough beds. Patients were in the hallways on makeshift beds. Blacks who were treated at white-run hospitals in the North were still discriminated against. They weren't getting the same kind of care. They were in separate rooms from white people. And there was a lack of health insurance for many black people. So he spent years, and this was his passion. He did this for years, and he worked with other black physicians and with the NAACP to try to raise this to a level of national discussion and to point out this unfair treatment. And finally, in 1962, the courts agreed. So if you remember, 1954 is when we had Brown v. Board of Education. Schools are desegregated. That did not apply to hospitals and medical clinics. But in 1962, the courts ruled that if you were a hospital and you received any kind of federal money, you had to integrate. You had to open your doors to everybody. And that was due in large part to the kind of research that Paul Cornelli did. And so that ruling was considered sort of the Brown versus Board of Education ruling for healthcare in our country. But he didn't stop because, racism was still going on. Racism is still going on. He marched with Dr. King, the March in Washington. He was the medical director for the march. He was a prolific writer, both in academic journals and for lay readers. He had a syndicated column that ran in African American newspapers around the country. He testified before congressional committees a number of times about how black and poor people were being left behind by this country. In 1969, he was elected president of the American Public Health Association, the very field that he wasn't even sure he wanted to go into, and now he was president of it. He's the first black man to head up that organization. And he was actually the first black man to head up any large professional medical organization in the country. He lived to be 95 years old, which I think is very impressive. The university gave him an honorary degree. At the School of Public Health, there is a fellowship that is awarded to underrepresented scholars who want to go into academic public health. Earlier this year, the School of Public Health dedicated the Paul Cornelli Community Room, which was really nice. And interestingly enough, that came about after a group of students in the School of Public Health petitioned the administration of the school to say, you're not paying enough attention to our black alumni and the impact they're making on the field. So I love that almost 100 years after Paul Cornelli joins the Negro Caucasian Club, his successors as students are still pounding the table saying, we've got to make some changes around here. So that is his story in a nutshell, and I would love it if you went to the website and took a peek at it. Just quickly, a few other stories we've done in the last 18 months to 2 years during COVID. The first teach-in, these two stories are both from 1965 actually. The first teach-in is about the Vietnam teach-in of 1965 that was organized and led by the faculty, and it became sort of the gold standard for teach-ins that were then adopted around the country throughout the Vietnam War. The Assassin's Widow is about Marina Oswald, whose husband was Lee Harvey Oswald, John F. Kennedy's assassin. And this story is about how she came to become a U of M student in 1965. And then a lighter story, Man's Best Friend, is about Leo, who was the much-loved dog of Henry Tappan, our first president. And there are just wonderful stories from students of that era and writings from Tappan himself about the gushing love he had for this dog. And he was just as well known on campus as President Tappan was. And the story's about the dog, but it's also about Henry Tappan. And then our most recent story, which we just published this past weekend, Invitation to a Nazi, is about the decision by a student organization to invite George Lincoln Rockwell to come to campus to speak. He was the self-anointed president of the American Nazi Party. And so the student organization invited him to come and talk. And as you might imagine, it set off quite a debate on campus about who should we allow to speak on our campus when hate is part of their platform. And so I think that got some strong interest. And so that's, again, a snapshot of the Heritage Project, and I'm happy to talk more about it when we get to that part. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, of course, I just lost my notes. Of course. Of course, Murphy's Law, right? You know what? I've practiced. So we're going to go for it. All right, friends. So this story was the cover story. I'm going to tell you about the cover story of Collections Magazine from a few months ago. And this story starts northwest of Dexter, Michigan, right where that star is. And it starts on March 20th, 1966. And right where that star is the home of Frank Manor. Now, he is a farmer, and he is at home with his wife and son, and about 8:30 that evening, he sees flashing lights outside of his home. So he runs outside to look and see what in the world is going on, and he sees this strange object above a lowland near his home, and it's got a crazy quilted surface to it, and it's got flashing lights, and it's going up and down, and his son sees it and his wife sees it, and they are like, what in the world is going on? And after a little while, the thing takes off in the sky with a loud crack. So Frank Manor calls the police. He's like, we have seen something. And instead of being laughed out of the room, the police tell him, we know what you've seen because we have seen it too. We have seen it, we've even taken pictures of it, and people have been calling all week, citing strange things in the sky. So what in the world does this have to do with the Bentley? Well, the interesting thing is that the Bentley Historical Library, this story touches so many aspects of the Bentley Historical Library, and it touches myriad collections, including, of course, newspapers. So we have lots of clippings because, of course, the newspapers were all over the strange lights in the sky. We also have multiple elected officials' papers. We have official correspondence between the elected officials who are writing among themselves, trying to figure out what's going on, and they also collected letters from their constituents who are writing to them saying, you gotta fix this, like what is going on? And then we also have U of M faculty papers where we've actually got researchers who became involved in this. Now, how in the world did reputable U of M researchers become involved in strange lights in the sky over Dexter, Michigan in 1966? And how in the world did UFO history become U of M history? Well, it begins with a physicist named Horace Richard Crane, and he is a physicist at the University of Michigan. And lest you think that he's some Doc Brown character who's just crazy and like, oh, there's aliens, we're going back in time, Marty. Like, he is not that guy, all right? So he is an incredibly reputable physicist. He's in the National Academy of Sciences. His research, he helped discover neutrinos. He helped create the technology that would be used in supercolliders. And this is him. This is a photo from his collection at the Bentley. This is him with this super collider technology that is still used today. So this guy is absolutely the real deal. So why in the world is why does his collection have stuff about UFOs in it? Well, to answer that, we have to go back to what happened that night on March 20th, 1966, and around that time in Ann Arbor to talk about what happened next. Because ultimately, the story I'm going to tell you tonight is really not about what happened that night, but what happened afterwards and how all of this impacted history. So this man is named Sheriff Douglas J. Harvey. Now, Sheriff Harvey, he believed his men. His men were the ones who were out in the field. Some of them even took pictures of these crazy lights, and they had seen them. And so he really believed his men. He knew Frank Manor. He knew Frank Manor wasn't a crazy guy. And so he said, listen, we've got to investigate this. And so he was asking people for help, and it really fell on deaf ears. Nobody wanted to help this guy. They were like, yeah, whatever. So finally, he found a sympathetic ear, and that sympathetic ear was a man named, it was his congressional representative named Weston Vivian. And that's Weston Vivian. And Weston Vivian said, I will help you. And so he put pressure on his colleagues in DC, who in turn put pressure on the military and the Air Force specifically. And the Air Force finally relented, and they said, fine, we will send out an investigator to look at what happened in this area in March 1966. We'll send somebody out to just figure it out. So the guy they send is this man. His name is J. Allen Hynek. And J. Allen Hynek is also no slouch. He is a physicist. He is at this time the chair of the Department of Astronomy at Northwestern University. And he is also has been a consultant for the military since World War II about strange stuff going on in the sky, because the military doesn't really know what's going on either. And they want input from people in the academy. So they bring him on, and initially this investigation by the military into strange objects in the sky is called Project Sign. It's actually first called Project Grudge, but then it's called Project Sign, and you might know it as Project Blue Book. It changes its name to Project Blue Book in 1952. So Hynek comes out, he goes to the Manor Farm, he's looking around, he's talking to everybody, he interviews the police, he talks to folks, and in the end he says, okay, I've heard it all, and what you all experienced was swamp gas. Okay? So this is a cartoon from the collection of a man who was the editor of the Ann Arbor News for a really long time, and this is in his collection, and it basically says, oh, the aliens tried to land in Ann Arbor and fill up on swamp gas, but it was too expensive, so they left. So ultimately, this swamp gas explanation, as you can imagine, is deeply unsatisfying to the people who thought they saw something in the sky, and they were like, no, this is not swamp gas. You need to do better. So, in its infinite wisdom, the government said, we will convene a panel. We will convene a committee. So they get together the Condon Committee, and basically the Condon Committee is a bunch of scientists from all around the country. They're from different states, they're from different regions, they study different things. There are lots of them, and they're led by a man named Edward Condon, another physicist. He's at the University of Colorado, and they all convene at the University of Colorado starting in 1966. And this committee meets for 2 years, and they review all of the findings that the government has. They have 59 case studies that they review, including the Michigan case study of these strange lights over Dexter. They review that. They review 58 others. There's 37 scientists who review all of this stuff over 2 years, and they put together a report that is more than 14,800 pages long. You can get it on Amazon if you really want it. It's there. You can order it. And basically, they were tasked with this question of, is there any there? In other words, the government was like, listen, should we be studying this? Should we be putting money toward figuring out what's in the skies above us? And the Condon Committee decided, after reviewing all of this evidence, said, no, there's really nothing of scientific value here. And I just want to say, this photo that I'm showing you is not from Collections magazine. It is from the Coloradan, which is the alumni magazine of the University of Colorado, and they have an archive there which is full of good stuff as well. So in the end, their findings, the Condon Committee findings, were also deeply unsatisfying to many people, so much so that the government said, okay, listen, we'll convene another committee about the committee. So government, right? We're going to convene another committee about the committee to review whether or not the Condon Committee got it right. So this committee is comprised of 11 people. 11 scientists. Now, they all are members of the National Academy of Sciences. This is important because it brings us back to our good friend Horace Richard Crane, right? So Horace Richard Crane is asked, will you be part of this 11-person committee to review the Condon report, all those 14,800 plus pages? And he says, okay, I'll do it. And the other person who says, okay, I'll do it, is David Dennison, for whom the Dennison Building is named here on campus. So Crane and his colleagues get together, they review all of those pages, and they conclude that, in fact, the Condon Committee got it right. There's really nothing of scientific value. Their report is called A Review of the University of Colorado Report of Unidentified Flying Objects by a Panel of the National Academy of Sciences. Very official, okay? And they were really like, yeah, there's no there. So in the end, the papers of Horace Richard Crane are filled with all of this information. You can go and see how all of this UFO stuff got wrapped up in his papers. He even has letters from Condon himself, who Condon bemoans that he ever got wrapped up in any of this. He's like, oh, this was a mess that was shrouded in controversy from the beginning. But the idea is not really whether you believe something happened that was more than swamp gas over the Manor's house that night. It's really not about that. What this story is about is how the different layers of research and archives and history come together at the Bentley. And those layers start with really the people who donate their papers, the citizens, the faculty, the government officials, the elected officials who donate their papers to us. And then there's the next layer of the archivists who organize them and process them and do God's work so we can make sense of them. And then there's another layer of writers like us and researchers who get to come in and try to connect the dots and try to make meaning out of those layers and tell the stories. And I think chances are that the archive might even have more UFO stuff in the future, because this is all back in the news again. If you've been watching it, it's interesting stuff. So we'll have to keep an eye on the archive and maybe an eye on the skies. So thank you guys.
Can't feed Dexter. Too sweet. All right, Gary, and I'm not sure how to do my part. Thank you for your help. Oh, thank you.
Huh. Okay, let's try again. There we go.
Oh, fabulous. Hi, I'm Deborah Holdship, and I'm the editor of Michigan Today, which is an online alumni magazine that goes to all the grads, faculty, and staff around the world once a month. So my presentation is going to be a little bit different from these guys. For me and our magazine, which, as you can see, this is the website, which also looks very much like the email. So it's all the same content that just went out last Saturday. You can see online or via the email that you receive in your inbox. So for me, the history in this case binds us in the memory of a shared experience. That happens a lot at Michigan Today. Or in this case, I'm going to be talking about a shared experience of a building. I often joke that Michigan Today should be called Michigan Yesterday, because our history stories are always the most popular on the website. And the most wonderful thing about Michigan Today, of course, is a level of reader engagement that we receive. We get so many comments on stories. We don't have a Facebook page, and so much of the activity takes place right at the site itself, which creates a real unity and kind of a togetherness. In recent years, other publications have shut down their comments, but ours are open, and the discourse is often really robust, and it's generally respectful and intelligent for the most part. And the best parts of the content or the comments are when it adds new content to the story, which happens a lot because people write in their memories and they have new anecdotes that weren't even part of the original story. And I can humbly say this reader engagement is not because of me, it predates me. So I don't take credit for it, but I work like mad to maintain it. In 2007, my predecessor, John Lofi, took the magazine from a print quarterly to this digital monthly. And at that time, he introduced our readers to a really talented writer that every one of us here uses and loves. He's our resident historian, Jim Tobin, who is a historian, author, an alum, a Michigan Daily alum, and he's also a professor of journalism at Miami of Ohio. So every month, Jim submits a story about some sort of historical, aspect of the university. It could be a person, an event, a place, whatever. And unless it's the lead, I tend to put it in the same place. I always put it in the same place in the email and always in the same place on the website so people know, oh, there's my history story, my Jim Tobin story. And no matter the story, whenever Jim pitches me, after we talk about it, our conversation usually ends with the comment, I can't wait to read the comments. Like, oh, this is going to be good. And it's, sometimes we're trying to make people mad, sometimes we're trying to make them laugh, whatever. But when we did this story about the Fleming building, we got a little more than we bargained for. And this ran last November. So if you come to campus now, you will see a chain link fence around this lovely building on this vintage postcard. It's nicknamed Fortress Fleming. So there's a chain link fence around it because it's coming down this year in the summer, quite soon, by end of July. They built, but then it's quite a young building too, which is kind of why we wrote about it and why we got the response we did. It was erected about 50 years ago to house the administration. And apparently Alden Dow, the architect, was going for like a Mondrian style, okay? So this is what he's going for. And if he hadn't been vetoed, according to Jim, Dow would have made the Fleming windows, which you can barely see because they're really small, he would have made those windows blue with maize trim, which would have been really pretty. It's a pretty common sentiment on this campus that this building is, for lack of a better word, ugly. Even on this lovely vintage postcard. I mean, few people have ever expressed love for the design of this building. Few have ever expressed a desire to work in it. Kim was just telling me someone she knew said the windows were so small so people couldn't jump out of it. And I mean, I've gotten lost every single time I've ever gone in it. It's crazy. But it was named for U of M President Robin Fleming, who was here during the very turbulent time on campus, the 60s and 70s. And a lot of people refer to him as a very skilled diplomat who did his best to keep the peace on this campus when things were just going out of control. So there was a lot of anti-Vietnam protests, anti-war protests. The rise of the Black Action Movement was heating up. The rise of the women's movement was heating up. So a lot of student activity, campus protest. Now, years later, here we are in the 2010s, the exterior masonry of the building apparently was starting to degrade. It needed emergency repairs, it needed annual inspections. So planners here on campus decided a full-blown fix would cost too much. So they decided to move the administration over to the old Ruth Venn Museums building, which did get rehabilitated. And it has those terrazzo pumas in front, which you may all remember. And that building was designed in 1928, but is more sound than Fleming. When we learned a building was coming down in 2022, this summer, Jim pitched a first-person essay. So this is a story told to you in the voice of Jim. So he could write his own feelings as a member of this alumni family that has all shared in this experience of this lovely, homely building. So as he describes it, the entrances are small and uninviting. Most of the windows are slits, either at floor level, at the level of the ceiling or floor. So you don't really get to look out the window and enjoy the outdoors. People have said for years it was designed as an actual fortress to protect administrators from marauding student protesters. Even tour guides say that when they walk around here. But according to Jim's piece, that is an urban legend. The building was designed years before students started taking over buildings. So we led our November issue with this piece, and we're lucky that the vintage postcard is so catchy. Like, I wanted a nice little historical version of the postcard, or of the building, instead of like a recent photo. We got 69 comments. It instigated quite a flurry of feedback. And they covered a really wide range of topics, which is why I chose this story. It's not just about the building itself. It's about architecture. It's about Alden Dow. Oops. It's about Robin Fleming, who was our president here. And we got comments about sustainability and other, sustainability and so much more. I mean, people wrote in memories, and it was just not like, I love the building, I hate the building, you're stupid, no, I love, that kind of stuff that you usually get. So one reader, a Boston-based lawyer, Jeffrey Lipshaw, had been a cartoonist at the Daily back in the day. And in 1974, he contributed this comic to the Daily, and he sent it to me after the story ran, and I slipped it into the story. And he said, I may have contributed to the urban legend about being a fortress. So you can see there's one thought bubble going, I'm afraid we're going to have to raise tuition 20% while cutting back on student services. And the other person saying, that's okay, over here the windows are bulletproof. So that, the legend enjoys the long tail of history, apparently, because people still believe that. So meanwhile, the comments, as you can see here, there's a lot of them, and they are as entertaining and interesting as the original story itself. So look how much more content you could read if you really wanted to. And I mean, it's pretty interesting. So go back to the top. Okay, so ironically, despite the fact that our whole story is about how ugly this building is, nobody likes it, the first comment is from a guy named Stuart Bagley. He liked the building. I'm like, dude, that's the first comment? You like the building? And then the second guy says, so I agree. Thank you, you guys. So they blew out our thesis right there. Well, later, a woman named Catherine Sanderson from 1990, right here, she took up the bunker argument, which we said does not exist. That's not true. And then this guy, Carl Freer, fired back with an argument about something called brutalist architecture, which I had never heard of, and that, which predated student protest, thus debunking the bunker argument. Then you have this guy, Aldous Lappins, law graduate. He had his own opinion. He says, unfortunately, I had to endure this paean to architectural ugliness for years while going to classes. James Cooper, 1972, noted that he could look out his window in West Quad and see a block M in the brickwork on the south side of the building. And then so you're like, what are you talking about? And then this guy writes in and goes, oh, here it is. So if you can see, and you may never have known, there is in fact a block M right here in the brick. Isn't that crazy? Didn't know. So that was nice. Oops, that was his Google Street link that he provided to us. So then, this guy, Thomas Goodsell, here's another good one. He says, as a Frosh, beginning in 1974, I took over the building, to advocate for more minority representation on campus. And then this guy, Jaime Colmenero, writes back and says, is that you who your roommates called Burnout Tom? So much for his grand career as a student protester. So funny. But I love that they talk to each other, So then this woman, Diane Demo Sadler, she noted that when this is completely unrelated to the Fleming building, she says, they're moving to that building with the pumas in front of it? And she says, of course you must remember the very sexist lore associated with those cats. They were supposed to roar if the women were virgins. And if they didn't, well, ... As for President Fleming, Doris Rubenstein, 1971 grad, she couldn't agree more that he deserved a more attractive building. She thought he was too good of a person to have such an ugly building named after him. But detractors of Fleming noted that, had another opinion of the president. So this guy, Anthony King, a grad from 03 and 2012, wrote, "This article does a great job of ignoring the policies of Fleming and their often negative impact on the black community. Fleming undermined or co-opted every black effort to make their time here better." Then he recommends a book that proves his point. So if you don't believe him, you can go read the book. Environmentalist Susan Weinberg from 1967, 71, and 75 complained that the decision to bring down the building was a crime against the environment. So she is definitely a sustainability person who can't understand why we are, destroying the environment by taking this building down. Now this guy, Larry Peace, another multiple grad, 73, 75, and 78, he lends a real historical significance to the building in the sense that he remembered confrontations between students and police there. And he said, "Those were important formative years for all of us and our country. The fortress architecture always represented the tension between the generations to me. I'll be sad to see the landmark go. Michigan's contribution to the growth of our country during those troubled times is important to remember." So he really sees the building as a symbol of that time and is sad to see it go. But then I actually had to laugh because after all this thoughtful discourse, there's this guy named Charles Snead, an actual architecture alum from 1982. And he wrote quite succinctly, "Not every building is timeless and worthy of preservation. 50 years is a pretty good run." Now, near the end of the comments, this guy, John Lyons from 1977, made sure we knew, he had issues with the whole story and all these comments. He says, "Alden Dow was a serious and underrated architect who does not deserve this ignorant trash talk. Why not preserve and protect and reuse?" And then he ends it with this, "I expect we'll see another of the school's high-rise, fake Gothic soul killers on this site. Ugh." And then there's this guy, Dave Burgett, very near the end, who, look at all these things, had kind of a mind meld with me. He's from 1977. He says, "I think we should be very hesitant to part with buildings that have artistic and historical merit, even if they are imperfect. I'm sorry to see the Fleming building go. Having been there for 50 years, it is part of the experience of the overwhelming majority of living alumni." And therein lies the whole reason why we did this story and generated this abundance of comments. So thank you, Dave Burgett, for understanding and verbalizing my editorial process. I'm always looking for stories that people who are here will remember and will share their feedback with us and their memories. So Dave says, "Let's hope that whatever is built there is a masterpiece and feels well worth the loss, and has large, well-placed windows." And I'll consider that as amen, and that's a story for Michigan tomorrow. So that's it for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, how about a hand of applause for all? I think that was great. A real smattering of different takes on the institution from different perspectives. And I want to make sure we have enough time for audience questions. So I guess the first thing I want to ask is, does any of you have any reflections on anything that your colleagues on the panel presented? Any reactions?
I think Deborah, in her closing remarks, summed it up really well. I know our stories on the Heritage Project that do the best, that resonate the strongest, are the ones that people have a connection to because they were here at the time or their parents were here at that time. So if it's a story from 1940 on, it resonates. If it's a story from 1850, it might be interesting, but people don't get in a lather about it.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, and all these stories are people that had participants who could write in and share their memories and stuff. I mean, it's very cool. And they can be wacky and funny, and who knows.
So let's go to the big topic, right? Why is writing about U of M history important? Why does it engage? I mean, you just sort of answered part of that, but you don't restrict yourselves to things that are within living memory of people necessarily, right? What is it about the history of this place or the history of any place that makes it important to write about it?
I feel like you have to know something in order to love it, and I do think that at Michigan, we all will say quite regularly, every single aspect of human history, Michigan, any significant event that has ever taken place in the world, every invention, every adventure, every advancement in human knowledge has an attachment to the University of Michigan. You can pick any story out of the ether almost, and that you will find an alum attached to it. And it's so great to create a sense of pride for alumni and just the living nature of it. That it's so great to just walk around and know. I'm sure Kim knows everything. Everyone here does. Oh, that used to be this, or oh, an outhouse used to be on that corner of the diag, and oh, ponies used to trot there. I mean, it's amazing. Oh, this is where the German side of the population lived in the other side, Division Street. Oh, what a concept. It just makes everything so much more relevant.
I think it helps explain who we are,
yes,
and how we became what we are, good and bad. Mm-hmm. It might be something as simple as, why is the diag the diag?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, for any student, the diag is important because it's been part of your life. The same with faculty, staff, anybody who works here. Mm-hmm. But why is it where it is? Why does it look the way it does? How did it evolve?
Who planted these trees?
And so, we did a story about that. Others have done a story about it. And I just think it helps give context and texture to the place.
And it gives you a sense of ownership, too. Yeah, especially if you participated in it.
I think people are here during such a formative time of their lives as well. I mean, these are 4 years where they're first time out of the house, the first time they're independent, they're meeting, lifelong friends, they're meeting their spouses, they're learning things that they're going to take with them for the rest of their lives, and it all happened here. So it's not just a place, it's like a frame of mind almost. It's a context for their lives that, they want to know more about. It touches, it just resonates a lot.
I think too, in an era of sort of fake news, it's easy to want to believe, even just about the windows in the building, right? It's easy to want to believe a certain narrative about something. I think that's part of the reason that the archives and preserving the archives is so important, is because we have the primary sources of history, and so we might want to believe something about the university or about Michigan or whatever, but the history, if we're getting it right, it'll tell us the truth, and we need to follow the truth.
And it's so neat. They recently, UMS did a movie about Hill Auditorium. I think it was called A Seat for Everyone. And they had moving footage of people in cloche hats and driving, Model Ts in front of Hill Auditorium. And it's oh my God, I walk by there every day. Look at those people. Those people are real. And it was so interesting to me that they were moving. And it's I'm watching a documentary about my own town where I go and that building. It's just fascinating to me. I'm walking on those same steps that lady in that cloche hat was wearing. I don't know why that's cool, but I think it is. I think it's amazing.
So when you think about a story, some of the stories that you were talking about tonight, Lara, you mentioned, UFOs are back in the news big time, right? And I know this was a story from a little bit ago, but do current events come into play when you're thinking about a historical story, and how does that happen?
We just found a fascinating document that was about the royal we, but my colleague April McKay found a document about how U of M would support women in their decisions about abortion, and they actually had clergy who would counsel them about their decision, and if they chose to get an abortion, they would facilitate that. They would facilitate them to cross state lines and go to New York where it was legal. And it was just such a fascinating, we posted it to social media because it was like, oh, the university has been helping women with this issue this was very pre-Roe. I mean, anyway, it was just one of those things where it's in the news, and it felt important to say that the university has been in dialogue with this topic for a very long time. And that's just one example. Sharon, I feel like I cut you off. I'm sorry.
No. I just think, a lot of times it provides a context for current issues that are going on, and that's an excellent example of what I was thinking of. Is that
I had a good one
these things
recently
are
where
happening
I got a
back-
phone call from a writer who was a Michigan Daily alum from the late 60s. His name is Roger Rappaport, who covered many of the protests at the Fleming Building back in the day. And he said, would you like a story on my uncle Anatole Rappaport, was like a relative, who was a very successful researcher and faculty member here, who was famous for his theories about game theory and negotiation and peace. He's very interested in peace. It turns out he's Ukrainian, and he escaped Ukraine in 1921 on ice skates as a 10-year-old boy. So we wrote this, it was so beautiful because it was Roger's own family, and he wrote this, and we sort of created this little adventure story. The war had just begun, and it was like, how can Michigan Today cover the war in Ukraine, this current event, other than just faculty commenting on how it was going to play out. So it was really fascinating, and then it also gave us an opportunity. Shirley Koppelman at the Ross School is an expert on Anatole Rappaport and is a contemporary researcher who is using his theories to advance her own work. So it was an opportunity to quote her and include all of that, and then to hear back from students who had known him. A woman called me who used to babysit for him, and she talked about how he played the piano and he was so beautiful, and it was just amazing. And people who had him as when they were students here had no idea of his backstory. And by virtue of being a child of war as he was, that informed everything he did about his peace work. So that was a really interesting piece.
So in the stories that you've written or published, I mean, Sharon, you told your story is about women from a period which in many ways their experience was very different, right? From women, at least maybe starting in the late 60s, early 70s, and perhaps up until today. But any reflections about how much does the student experience change, and how much does it kind of stay the same?
I think just, and this is just a very small example, but you can read letters through the decades of students writing home saying, it's cold here, I didn't pack enough socks or sweaters, they're homesick. And then at the end of the 4, maybe 5 years, they don't want to leave. We have a story about Raul Wallenberg, who was a student here in the 30s and went on to save thousands from the Holocaust. And he just loved being a college student. And he loved being a college student here. And one of the things he wrote in his final days was, I'm just beginning to feel at home here in my little Ann Arbor. And he didn't want to leave. And I think a lot of alums feel that way. That, I don't want to go out into the big bad world.
And in his case, if he hadn't left, imagine the tragedy
Right.
that would have happened for all those families and those people. So it's like, we're lucky he left.
So sometimes people make a distinction between heritage or tradition and history. Right? And any reflections on that? I mean, how do you balance positive and negative aspects in the history of the University of Michigan as you're thinking about stories?
Kim and Jim discuss that quite regularly.
Yeah, we do.
Yes, I know.
On the Heritage Project site, we try to tackle some of those hard stories. When we began the project, one of our guiding principles was this isn't going to be a rah-rah site. There are places for that, and they're popular, but we're going to take a deeper dive into our history. And I mean, obviously, we just scratch the surface with the stuff we write about. But I think we've taken on some, touchy stories, and tried to present them thoughtfully and, tell some of the uglier chapters from our history, because they are part of our history.
Yeah, and I know Jim Tobin often, I mean, it's about trust. We've talked about this as well amongst ourselves. Like, you want the alumni to trust what you're sharing with them. And if it is all rah-rah, you know, there's a line, you know, it's like, it can't all be that good.
Right.
Yeah, and I don't remember it that way. So it's nice to be able to have, you know, even that commenter who didn't like Robin Fleming, that was one of the first times I'd ever read something like that from a reader, you know, after a story like that. I'm like, oh, I didn't know that maybe, you know, from my white perspective, Robin Fleming was fantastic. From a young black student's perspective, not so much, you know. So it's really important to get both sides of that story out. And it doesn't hurt anybody. We all know this stuff happened, you know, so.
And I think it helps speak to the credibility of the institution. I mean, we're a university. We're supposed to be seeking the truth.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to pretend any of us are faculty and this is, you know, we're at that level, but we should be able to tell the hard stories about the University of Michigan, and our alumni should be able to accept them.
Yeah.
That this is what happened at your school, and if it makes you a little uncomfortable, that's okay. Maybe it triggers you to do something in a positive way going forward.
So before we open it to Q&A, maybe one last question. Anything in the works for any of you that you would like to share a little hint about before?
You know, we never do
I'm
that.
not working on it anymore because I'm not at the Alumni Association anymore, but bless you. The Alumni says the Michigan Alum magazine is working on a piece about the 50th anniversary of Title IX and how that affected co-eds on campus. Not, you know, mainly sports. Sports is what you think about, but as I mentioned earlier, women weren't allowed in the marching band until 1972. So I'm looking forward to reading that article myself. So.
And I've been working on a story, it's just not there yet, about the university arresting gay men in the late 50s and early 60s. Students predominantly, but faculty. And students were expelled for being homosexual, which was a crime at that time, and had to basically have a note from their psychiatrist to be re-enrolled as students. Writing about that chapter of our history.
Yay.
Yay! But it's important, I think.
Working on a story about a Bentley initiative. We have a ton of collections related to the Philippines, and how we acquired that is really problematic. There's also lots of Philippine collections across campus at other museums, and we're in an initiative to sort of repair and decolonize some of those pieces and some of the things in those collections, and it's difficult and challenging work to look back at the university's sort of complicit role in the Philippines, and it's complicated. But there's a cool mystery. We have a small painting that may or may not be by a famous Philippine artist. So we're investigating that, and it's really cool. And if it is, it's going to be a gem of a story. That'll be a sidebar, but it's a nice metaphor actually for some of this work. So it's cool.
For me, I came in here like with my little secret idea, but I didn't want to get scooped by anyone. But it's so funny how we are. But yeah, but Lara has my story already. I really wanted to investigate, or do want to investigate, and hope maybe we can do this together, about pre-Roe v. Wade on campus. I saw this great documentary called The Janes, and it was about these women in Chicago who had sort of an underground railroad for young women. And I just wanted to find out if we had that here, and maybe to talk to some women who had experienced that and how they handled it. Mm-hmm. So I want to talk to actual people who are still alive and can tell me. So, but I hadn't started. I didn't know where to start. I did ask a woman one day on the diag, an older woman with a clipboard. She was getting Planned Parenthood signatures for a petition. And if you're wondering how one finds a source for a story, I'm like, did you go to school here? She said, no, unfortunately. But I was going to ask her if she knew anyone back in the day. So yeah, I mean, we have to start somewhere. And now that I was so excited when I heard you say that you guys found that. So
we'll talk.
Okay.
Thank you
I'll
all.
poke your eye out until you give me that story. Don't take it from me.
Thank you all for sharing that. So I want to open it up to the audience. So if you're here in person, I think we remember how to do this, right? You raise your hand and I'll recognize you. If you're online, please put your question in the comments, and Andrew Rutledge is going to pass them on. So let's start with the people here. Yes, sir. Yeah.
I'm obliged to say in the beginning that my wife loved the curfew.
Oh.
She didn't want to be stuck out till midnight. 10:30 on the weekdays was too much.
Very interesting.
But my question is,
Good
how to
excuse.
approach the Bentley to ask a question without wasting your time? I'm interested in, I know a little bit about a private committee that prepared the university for World War II in anticipation, among other things, that there would be civil unrest here in Ann Arbor. And if went on and asked the library on the net, and they didn't know how to approach the Bentley. So what I want to do is come in and say, I don't know whether somebody's already written about this, whether you've got the information, or whether I've got more than you. But I don't want to take anybody's time if it's not the thing.
Well, let's just disavow this idea that you're wasting anybody's time by asking a question. So please, like, ask the Bentley, and I think my reference colleagues would be delighted to help you. And in fact, my colleague Brian is here, who knows an awful lot about that topic, and so you guys might be able to talk. But please, like, come to the archive and ask us questions. And I say us because I'm not an archivist. But I'll talk to you, and I'll try to connect you to the right people. How's that?
Any others? Yes.
I have to give a little bit of background because the story starts at Hopkins. And I found out when I was going to Hopkins for my PhD, which is late 50s, early 60s, that Hopkins had a quota for Jewish students, undergraduate students, and they explained this. They did not publish it, but they explained it to the researcher who was helping them do research on emissions and economists. That in general, the Ivy League schools, all with medical schools, did this in the East, because otherwise they felt their medical school would be 100% Jewish practically if they changed their admissions policy. And I observed that. I came to Michigan much later to teach. But what struck me from knowing alumni was that, and from one of the things I learned was that there were more subscriptions to the New York Times in Ann Arbor than Albany, New York. I'm not sure of this, but that supposedly Ann Arbor took more daily New York Timeses than any city in New York other than New York City. And which also tends to say that from lots of New Yorkers are here, lots of Jewish students must be here. But I have no idea, and I've pursued some things, and I certainly am not thinking that there was no anti-Semitism in Michigan. But I wondered, I bet you, but I have no way to find out, that at some point the admissions office did not do that. I don't know if they did it before, but they probably stopped doing it at some point, is my bet, since we had a medical school. But it only took a limited number of students. But it's a question I have that I don't want to pursue it. I want somebody else to pursue it.
Well, you had an author, faculty members in a previous program who explored some of this.
Yeah, there's a great book by Andy Markovitz and Ken Garner. Andy Markovitz is on the faculty here that looks into the experience of Jewish students at U of M from about, the bulk of it focuses on the 19-teens up until sort of World War II. And my recollection is that there weren't official quotas. Brian can correct me if I'm wrong, but there were not official quotas that anybody has been able to find. But as you say, this does not mean that there was no prejudice or anti-Semitism on campus. Do you want to add anything, Brian? Is there anything?
Well, we did find a letter in the medical school that somebody had sent. Their father had attended in the 40s, and it got sent to the university. And so we have it in the president's papers sometime in the 1990s. It's a faculty member in the medical school referencing they could only take a certain number of Jewish interns in their department at the time. So there were some of those things. It didn't sound like it was extremely official, but this faculty member did give voice to it.
Good question. Andrew has an online. Great.
Somebody in the chat wants to know, how has social media affected the collection of information that you all brought on for your work and your stories? Change things dramatically?
Can you ask that again? Sorry.
How has social media affected the collection of information you use for your work and thinking about stories?
Well, we use social media quite a bit to get sources, like for this curfew story I was talking about. We did a story on something totally different on the JFK visit, but there was this comment and sort of sparked an idea. So we'll use it that way. We might see something that can develop into a further story. Or if we're looking for sources like Deborah, and unfortunately you don't have a Facebook page, but you could source that abortion story in Facebook or Twitter somehow if you wanted to. We found a lot of sources that way.
Yeah, I think it's a way to throw out story ideas and get story ideas because somebody will comment or share something that you just didn't know.
Yeah.
We did a crowdsourcing piece a couple years ago where we asked folks, we had these photos of the Civilian Conservation Corps, which was segregated, and there were African American Civilian Conservation Corps members. We didn't know who they were. They were beautiful images and they were pretty rare. And so we asked the public to help us. That wasn't necessarily just limited to social media, but it had a social component, and we were able to identify some of the people in that photo as a result too.
So cool.
Yeah. Very cool.
Yes, I was here in '63 as an undergrad, and I was working with Pat and Jerry Brewer, who did the Michigan Student Study. Did ever anything come of it?
I don't know.
Do not know.
Michigan Student
4,000
Survey?
students.
It was a student survey, it's called?
Yes.
Okay.
So Brian's nodding his head because Brian knows everything.
Brian is the archivist. Brian should answer all the questions.
I've heard of it, but I don't know exactly what it came. But I know we have some material on it in the archives.
Were you one of the students who was surveyed?
No, I just did all the card data. Through the computers and color coders and so on. I got my first start with the girls.
Nope.
And they were just spectacular.
Duly noted.
Okay, well, thank you again so much. This was really great. Really appreciate it. I want to encourage our audience to check out these publications if you don't already know about them. They are all excellent, and I really appreciate your sharing your thinking about some of this. Thanks also to Andrew Rutledge for monitoring the YouTube commentary, and the Michigan Media team for handling the YouTube streaming and video. Thank you again, audience, both places. And again, we'd love feedback on this hybrid format or anything about this. We're looking for ways to improve in this old and new world that we're getting into. Michigan Media will be back in September. We're taking July and August off, but we'll be back in September. And in fact, the topic is going to be Anatole Rappaport, whom Deborah just mentioned, and we will have Shirley Koppelman from the business school, and Roger Rappaport, whom you mentioned, who's a filmmaker and author, and Anthony Rappaport, who is Anatole's son, very accomplished violist, and will give sort of some personal insights. The story in Michigan Today is great. If you have a chance to look at it, I encourage you to do it, and I hope you can join us in September. Tonight's session will be available on our website in a week or two. For those of you here at the Observatory, you are welcome this evening to have a look around when we wrap up here. We have student docents upstairs. They are very knowledgeable. They are thrilled to explain things about the observatory. And we may, looking at Austin, I think we may have a little chance of observing, or no, the moon's too late. The moon's down. Okay, the moon's down. Too bad. Okay, so no looking through the telescope, but there's a lot of fun information about the telescope. And for those of you online, I hope that you can join us here in person sometime. Check out our website for upcoming events. So until September, everybody be safe, stay well, keep hope, that's important, right? And have a good summer, and good night. Thank you.